Hey everybody, welcome to Men Need to Be Heard. If this is your first time watching the channel, my name is Dan and I speak out and raise awareness on the issues and double standards that men and boys face in today's modern society. And today I'm sharing another video in my series called The Falsehoods of Feminism, where I talk about common beliefs and claims that feminists make and how the reality of those claims isn't really what they say it is. And today I'm taking on one of the biggest, which is the fallacy of the so-called patriarchy, or as I like to put it, the Phaketriarchy. One enduring myth perpetuated in almost every feminist narrative is the idea that men throughout history have all led lives of privilege and luxury. That men have had it easy, not just now, but throughout all of human history, and across all cultures and all nations. The bridge that feminism wants to sell you is that men as a group have sat around doing nothing all day, while women did all the work. This oversimplified and inaccurate portrayal fails to account for the harsh realities faced by both men and women in pre-industrial societies, and even now. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to focus on a time frame that is often referred to by feminists as the height of the patriarchy, the time when women were completely oppressed, and men, of course, were the ones doing it. That time frame they often use is the Middle Ages, a time period which ran from roughly the 500s to the 1500s. Now, it should be noted that while they like to use that time frame for their point of reference, what they have to say really applies over a much longer period, both before and after that. But also, in fact, much of what I'm going to talk about existed long before the Middle Ages and continued well into the 1800s, and in some places even the 1900s. In some parts of the world, it even continues today. And I also want you to note that I'm going to focus on Europe, though I'm sure many feminists will use that to argue that it's my white privilege talking, which helps them to dismiss what I'm saying, even though the actual facts are, it wasn't all that much different in other parts of the world. So they can think what they want to. Reality, well, it says something different. So let's begin our discussion with the first mistake that feminists make, which is to generalize who made up the population. It's an important distinction and one that feminism completely ignores in almost every case. You see, while they often refer to things like men living like kings and doing nothing, while women, of course, toiled away with no acknowledgement or appreciation, the reality of it is anything but. First off, the number of men, and women for that matter, that were kings or queens, or in the aristocracy as they called it back then, were very few and far between. In fact, the entire group made up less than 3% of the population. Yet feminism focuses on that 3% almost exclusively to make their arguments, which even if you account for that, doesn't tell the real picture anyway. Because while it's fair to say the aristocracy may have had things a bit easier than most certainly they weren't just sitting around doing nothing all day. Well, at least not the men, that is. The aristocratic women, most of whom were waited on hand and foot by servants, well, let's just say I don't think many queens were off fighting wars or doing the other things that kings had to do to maintain their realm. And instead of using that misrepresentation that defines the feminist mantra, we're instead going to focus on those who were the actual average men and women who existed in the Middle Ages. The ones that made up over 85% of the population. The ones most commonly known as the peasant class. Because they, far more than the aristocracy, paint a more realistic picture of what life was like for both men and women. Which, by the way, is exactly the reason why feminist dogma completely ignores them. For the average person, the peasants if you will, life in the Middle Ages was defined not by privilege, but by relentless labor and a never-ending fight for survival. And the truth is, men in particular often bore the immense physical burdens and responsibilities needed to survive. Contrary to what feminists say, men weren't just sitting around doing nothing while women slaved away cooking and cleaning. Oh no, they were out doing back-breaking work day after day, year after year, decade after decade. For the overwhelming majority of men, life revolved around grueling agricultural labor. They worked from dawn to dusk, tilling fields, planting crops, and harvesting grain using rudimentary tools like wooden plows and hand scythes. There were no machines to sow the seeds or harvest the crops. It was all done by hand, one seed, one crop at a time, from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, every week. No 2-week vacations, no calling in sick, no mental health days. The few tools that they did have required significant physical effort to use, making farming an arduous task at best. A task which continued throughout the years, indeed their entire lives, with nary a break. The work was also seasonal, and those seasonal work patterns dictated the rhythms of life and left little options for those doing it. During that period, which by the way isn't all that different for farmers today, you couldn't decide, the harvest can wait a day or two, or the crops can be sown next week. Failure to abide by that seasonal schedule didn't mean you didn't get a paycheck. It meant you and your family didn't survive. And in addition to farming, men often worked in specialized trades to provide for their families. Blacksmiths, for example, endured blistering heat for hours at a time while forging tools and weapons. Masons toiled in dangerous conditions, chiseling stone for cathedrals and castles. You know, those castles that feminists want you to believe every man had. These trades demanded not only strength, but years of apprenticeship, during which young men, boys really, labored under extremely harsh conditions for little or no reward. Life expectancy was short, averaging around 40 years, with many succumbing to accidents, malnutrition, or disease. Even those fortunate enough to escape the hazards of manual labor faced the looming threat of conscription. Soldiers who were exclusively men endured brutal conditions, from long marches and inadequate food to the constant risk of death in battle. Far from living like kings or the heroic portrayals that Hollywood and feminists like to lead you to believe, men in the Middle Ages bore the brunt of most, if not all, of the physical suffering and societal demands. And speaking of those castles I just mentioned and the notion that men sat around them being waited on by the women in their lives, well, to say it's a gross distortion of history would be an understatement. The very castles themselves, the ones feminists like to browbeat men with, actually tell the true story. You see, castles were constructed by specialized labor forces, again, almost exclusively men, under the direction of the nobility. Their main purpose wasn't for men to live a life of luxury in. Oh no, my friends. Instead, they served as military strongholds or administrative centers. These fortresses were defensive in nature, designed to repel invaders, not as romantic homes for noble women. Construction was dangerous and grueling, and took months, years even. And the men who built them on a daily basis, like the farmers, worked from dawn to dusk and faced hazards such as falling from scaffolding, accidents involving heavy stones, and exposure to the elements. Oh, what, you thought if it was raining or snowing, they got the day off? Hardly. In many cases, these projects spanned decades, meaning the men who labored on them often never actually saw the completion of their work. Yet feminism wants to romanticize all of that. It wants you to believe that everyone had a castle and they just magically appeared out of thin air. What they really want you to believe is those castles were built by women for men. And the image of castles as symbols of male privilege completely ignores the reality of the immense physical toll on the men who built them and the utilitarian purposes they served. And now that we've talked about the men, let's talk a bit about the life of the average woman during the Middle Ages, because they too faced their own set of challenges, particularly within the domestic sphere. The fact is, as feminism loves to point out, For the most part, they were indeed, for much of their lives, sitting and working, barefoot and pregnant, in the kitchen. While the men were out in the fields working, they were tasked with taking care of the home and raising the children. And to be fair, in many rural communities, women at times had to work alongside the men in the fields, harvesting crops and tending to the livestock. Inside the home, their responsibilities did include cooking, cleaning, spinning wool, and brewing ale. Tasks made more labor-intensive by the lack of modern conveniences. That's all true. And life for a woman during the time period was anything but easy. Something that feminism in fact gets right, but not in the dystopian way that feminism portrays, the way that it was women and only women doing all the work. And we'd be remiss if we didn't point out one of the riskiest undertakings that women, and only women, had in that time period, which was childbirth. Childbirth was one of the most, if not the most, dangerous aspect of a woman's life. Without access to modern medicine, complications during labor were common, and maternal mortality rates were high. And even surviving childbirth often left women with chronic health issues, compounding their daily struggles. I certainly don't want to dismiss or lessen in any way the struggles that women had. But unlike feminists who want to portray that men had it easy, the reality is life for both men and women during that time period, just like it is now, was difficult. Very, very difficult. And while women's roles were demanding, their hardships do not negate the physical and societal challenges that men faced. In the end, they had no choice but to work together, to take on roles that best suited their abilities. The survival of families, of communities, of the entire human race for that matter, depended entirely on the complementary efforts of both genders, highlighting the cooperative nature of life in pre-industrial societies. Now let's dive further into some of the realities of life in the Middle Ages, other things that feminism rarely, if ever, talks about. As we've pointed out, lives were harsh for both men and women. Famine, disease, and war affected entire communities, and survival required collective effort. During times of scarcity, it was men who bore the responsibility of securing food or defending the community, while women managed the households under increasingly dire circumstances. Social hierarchies further exacerbated those struggles. While the nobility and clergy enjoyed greater privileges, as we've discussed, the overwhelming majority of the population, both men and women, lived in poverty. Feminism's attempts to frame historical gender roles as universally oppressive for women or privileged for men oversimplifies a very complex social dynamic. You'll often hear feminists and women in general talk about how they didn't get the right to vote until roughly 100 years ago. And while it's true that women in the United States didn't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment was passed, it overlooks the reality that the vast majority of men in all countries, especially in the Middle Ages, lacked any political power of their own. They were, in fact, in pretty much the exact same situation as women. Peasants had no voting rights and no say in the decisions that governed their lives. It was the feudal system which placed power in the hands of monarchs and nobles, with the peasants serving as little more than laborers or soldiers that ruled. The right to vote was not extended to ordinary men until much later. In England, for example, property-owning men, which were very rare, gained suffrage gradually through the reforms, such as the Representation of People Act of 1832. Universal male suffrage, where any man could vote, in many Western countries, didn't arrive until the very late 19th or early 20th century. For women, voting rights came later, but in relatively close succession. The suffragette movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries pushed for universal suffrage, with milestones such as the aforementioned 19th Amendment in the United States and the Representation of the People Act in the UK being passed at about the same time. But feminism ignores the reality, in fact works to hide it. Their so-called timeline seeks to obfuscate reality and plays down the truth that disenfranchisement affected both men and women historically, with ordinary men, just like women, only gaining their right to vote through centuries of struggle. And another inconvenient fact that feminism likes to ignore is that it was men, and only men, of all classes, that faced the constant threat of conscription. A paradigm that, with the exception of very, very few countries, Israel for example, continues to this day. Men in the 21st century are subject to conscription, while women are not, in almost every country in the world. So much for equality, right? And let's remember that wars in the Middle Ages lasted for years, in some cases decades, and saw thousands upon thousands of peasants drafted into military service. Those soldiers endured absolutely brutal conditions with little pay and very high mortality rates. Battles were fought with swords, pikes, and rudimentary firearms, requiring immense skill and endurance. Injuries were frequent, and medical care, that was almost non-existent, leading to infections that often and usually proved fatal. Surviving soldiers, they frequently returned to find their farms in disrepair and their families struggling to make ends meet. Far from what Hollywood, the media, and feminists want you to believe, they weren't exalted, far from it. Instead, these men, more often than not, faced a diminished quality of life after their service. Now let's dig a bit more into the contrasts of how men and women lived, how their life was during this time frame, which in many ways isn't all that dissimilar to the differences in what life is like now in 2024 as I film this for men and women. The labor men performed often carried a far greater physical risk, whether in the fields, the workshops, or on the battlefield. And while women certainly faced their own dangers, particularly related to childbirth and societal expectations, both sexes were constrained by rigid roles dictated by survival, not society, survival, with little room for personal ambition or freedom. While feminist narratives sometimes emphasize the oppression of women in historical contexts, they almost always overlook the immense physical and societal burdens placed on men. They completely ignore the reality that men were just as oppressed as women in almost every way. A balanced perspective reveals that life in the Middle Ages, just as it is now in its own way, was difficult for everyone, shaped by a harsh and unforgiving environment. Feminism has long had the goal of fighting for women, and that's admirable. But to do so by using false narratives, by focusing solely on the issues women face both now and throughout history, all while seeking to hide the fact that men had many of the same issues, not to mention issues of their own, is disingenuous at best. And the truth is, it doesn't help women to do that. In fact, it hurts them. These modern narratives that feminism uses to romanticize history in some aspects and vilify one gender in others oversimplifies the realities of the past. The majority of men in the Middle Ages, just as now, did not live lives of privilege. They labored, they fought, and they sacrificed to provide for their families and for their communities. They toiled for years, decades even, with no acknowledgement or appreciation for any of the work and sacrifice that they made. The myth that men as a group built castles for women or lived as kings ignores the shared hardships that defined pre-industrial life, just as it largely ignores the many hardships that today's men face. Only by examining historical realities and recognizing the facts behind them can we better appreciate the cooperative efforts required from both sexes in order for them to survive. It's time we did away with this false narrative, the one that seeks to define, not just for now, but for all of history, that men lived a life of privilege. And until and unless we debunk that myth and do away with the anti-male paradigm behind it, we can never foster a nuanced, balanced understanding of history, or even address the issues going forward. A time-worn saying is that history tends to repeat itself. And we need to, as a group, acknowledge that history, that true history. A history which should focus on honoring not just the work and sacrifice of women, but the sacrifices of both men and women. And until we do that, we can never acknowledge the progress that humanity has made, or for that matter, could make well into the future. Thanks for watching, and do me a favor, if you enjoyed this video, give me a like, and let me know down in the comments your thoughts on the historical sacrifices that men and women made, and how they matter today. And be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so that you'll know when new videos on the issues and topics that men and boys face are posted. Until next time, have a great day.